The cockpit is a cramped, noisy world of worn green leather and scratched perspex. At 18,000 feet, the air is thin and bitterly cold, a chill that seeps through the electrically heated flight suit and leather jacket. You can feel the deep, throated rumble of the Pratt & Whitney R2008 engine through the seat, a vibration that has become as familiar as your own heartbeat. Outside, the world is a map, serene and distant. Occupied France stretches out beneath the wings in a patchwork of green and brown fields, neatly stitched together by hedgerows. A silver ribbon, the Seine, snakes off toward the horizon. Further south, the dark, ominous smudges of German airfields are just visible. You feel safe up here, detached, a god looking down from the heavens. This is standard fighter sweep altitude. This is where you're supposed to be. You are wrong. In the summer of 1943, American fighter pilots were dying at this altitude faster than the Army Air Forces could replace them. The numbers, stark and unadorned in after-action reports, told a brutal story. Between June and September 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 214 fighter aircraft over Europe. Not to mechanical failure, not to running out of fuel, but to German fighters that could climb faster, turn tighter, and had been fighting and killing in these skies since 1940. The Luftwaffe's Bf-109s and FW-190s owned the altitudes between 15,000 and 25,000 feet. They had perfected the bounce, diving out of the blinding sun, their 20 cannons shredding a P-47 Thunderbolt into a falling comet of fire and metal, then climbing back to the safety of altitude before the American pilot even knew what hit him. Every mission briefing became a grim casualty prediction. You'd look around the room at the faces of men you drank with, played poker with, and wonder which chairs would be empty that evening. Major Hubert Hubb, Zemk commanded the 56th Fighter Group at RAF Halesworth. By August 1943, he had watched too many empty chairs appear in the mess hall. The tactical doctrine, the gospel he and every other pilot had been taught, wasn't working. The Army Air Forces had trained its pilots to maintain altitude advantage at all costs, to fight in the vertical plane, to never, ever give up your height. It was sacrosanct. It was also getting everyone killed. Zemk, a pragmatist with a fierce intellect, started thinking about the forbidden. What if altitude was the problem, not the solution? What if the answer, the key to survival and victory, was down, not up? The idea sounded insane. Flying low meant you couldn't see threats coming from above. It meant one moment of inattention, one misjudgment, would crater you into French soil before you could react. It meant flying slow enough that German flak guns, the deadly 20 and 37 cannons that protected airfields and strategic points, could track you with ease. Every tactical manual, every instructor at flight school, declared low-level penetration to be suicide for single-engine fighters. But Zemk looked at the reports of the 214 lost aircraft and asked a simple, devastating question. Compared to what? Compared to the current survival rate, because whatever they were doing wasn't working either. In September 1943, Zemk quietly pulled aside 3 of his most experienced and trusted pilots, Captain Walker Budd Mahurin, Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, and Captain Gerald W. Johnson. He told them to forget everything they had learned about altitude discipline. On their next mission, after their primary bomber escort duty was complete, he wanted them to drop down, not to 10,000 feet, not to 5,000, all the way down. He wanted them to skim the trees and see what happened. If they got caught, marshaled for it, he told them, he would take the entire blame. The 3 pilots looked at each other. They had all lost friends, wingmen, in the past month. The memory of those losses was fresher and more compelling than any regulation. They agreed. On September 27, 1943, those 3 P-47 Thunderbolts, their massive radial engines roaring, dove from 18,000 feet to a mere 200 feet over the French countryside. The world transformed in that dive. The serene map became a rushing, terrifyingly intimate landscape. They flew so low that French farmers, hearing the thunderous approach, dove into ditches for cover. They flew fast, pushing their throttles forward, the airspeed indicators touching 350 miles per hour. And then something unexpected happened. They spotted a German airfield near the town of Booz. Focke-Wulf FW-190s lined up on the tarmac like toys, utterly exposed. The Luftwaffe pilots and ground crews never saw them coming. The 3P-47 screamed across the field at propeller height, their 50 caliber Browning machine guns hammering in a deafening staccato. 4 FW-190s exploded into fireballs before the German gunners even reached their flak positions. The 3 Americans pulled up, stayed low, and raced for home. 0 losses, 4 confirmed kills. A revolution had just begun, not with a roar from on high, but with a whisper at treetop level. Flying at treetop level wasn't just about flying low. It was about weaponizing physics in ways that turned every German advantage on its head. When you are at 50 feet, traveling at 350 miles per hour, the conventional rules of aerial combat cease to exist. They become abstractions, irrelevant theories to the man fighting for his life in the cockpit. The Luftwaffe had a sophisticated network of radar stations scattered across France. The Freya and Wurzburg systems could spot Allied bomber formations 80 miles out at altitude. They would then vector Bf-109s and FW-190s to intercept with plenty of time to climb, position, and attack. But radar waves travel in straight lines and the Earth is curved. Below 500 feet, an aircraft disappears into what radar operators called ground clutter. The messy, chaotic radar returns bouncing off hills, buildings, and trees. At 50 feet, you were invisible. You became a ghost, screaming across the French countryside at 6 miles per minute, a phantom strike that left no warning echo on a German radar screen. The reaction time advantage was even more devastating. Imagine a German pilot at a forward airfield, sitting in the cockpit of his FW-190, its BMW engine warming up for a morning patrol. At 18,000 feet, he would get a 3-minute warning from the radar stations. Plenty of time to take off, gain altitude, and prepare for a fight. At 50 feet, the first warning he got was the visceral, bone-shaking sound of a Pratt & Whitney R2008 100 engine howling over the tree line. From that first terrifying sound to the impact of 50 caliber shells was a span of about 11 seconds, not enough time to sprint to his aircraft, not enough time for the ground crews to man the flak guns. Barely enough time for the human brain to understand that death had arrived. American pilots started catching German fighters on the ground with their wheels still chocked, with pilots still climbing into their cockpits. It was slaughter, not combat. The sheer speed differential became a powerful survival tool. A P-47 at full throttle, doing 350 miles per hour at ground level, was moving too fast for German gunners trained on high-altitude tracking. Flak crews calculated lead time based on altitude and speed. They fired at where the target asterisk would be asterisk, but at hedge, hopping altitude, those complex calculations collapsed. The time of flight for an 88 mm shell was significant. By the time it reached the point in space where you were supposed to be, you had already traveled a quarter of a mile past it. The light flak, the 20 mm and 37 mm guns that required visual tracking and smooth leading motions, were equally confounded. You were not a predictable, distant speck. You were a blur, a thunderous noise that appeared and vanished before the gunner's brain could fully process what his eyes had seen. Then there was the pursuit problem. Suppose against the odds a Bf-109 pilot spotted your low-flying formation and dove to engage. He has the speed from the dive, he has the positional advantage, he has you dead to rights. Except he doesn't, because at 50 feet there is no room for error, no margin for forgiveness. Every pursuit maneuver he makes, every turn, every dive, risks flying his aircraft directly into a hillside, a church steeple, or a dense stand of trees. You are not just evading his guns, you are forcing him to make an impossible choice between killing you or killing himself. most German pilots trained for the expansive combat arena of high altitude where you had 10,000 feet of sky below you as a buffer instinctively pulled up. Nobody had trained them to dogfight at the altitude where birds live. The psychological pressure completely reversed. Suddenly, the hunter was terrified, flying in an environment that felt alien and hostile, while the prey, the American pilot, was the one who was comfortable, who had learned the language of this new, dangerous world. American pilots quickly discovered they could use the terrain itself as a weapon, much like a submarine uses the ocean's depths. See a German fighter diving on you, drop the nose and plunge into a river valley, following its serpentine curves at wave top height. The Bf-109 pilot either loses visual contact immediately or is forced to follow you into a maze of hills and slopes where his superior speed becomes a lethal liability. Spot a village ahead. Fly straight through it, using the buildings as shields, ducking behind church steeples, using water towers and tree lines as momentary cover. Everything, a barn, a hedgerow, a low hill became tactical cover. The Luftwaffe had owned the sky, the Americans stole the ground and turned it into their most potent ally. Physics didn't care about doctrine, and at 50 feet, physics was unequivocally on America's side. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't designed for this. Republic Aviation had built it as a high-altitude interceptor, a 7-ton monster of an aircraft meant to escort B-17s and B-24s at 25,000 feet where the air was thin and its massive turbo supercharger mattered most. Its enormous R2800 engine generated over 2,000 horsepower, but all that power was optimized for climbing and high-speed performance in the stratosphere. When pilots like Mahurin and Johnson started bringing these behemoths down to treetop level in late 1943, they returned to base with shredded belly panels, damaged oil coolers, and tales of impacts with foliage and wires that should have killed them. Republic's engineers reviewing the damage reports realized they had accidentally built the perfect low-level fighter. It just needed to be finished. The first modification was pure survival engineering. Starting in December 1943, Republic began adding quarter-inch armor plating to the P-47's belly and lower engine cowling. This wasn't primarily protection against enemy bullets, it was protection against France. At 50 feet, you weren't just dodging enemy fire, you were dodging the landscape itself. Pilots were clipping branches, smashing through telephone wires, and somehow staying airborne. The belly armor meant that when, not if, you scraped a treetop or a rooftop, you might survive the impact. They added reinforced brackets around the oil cooler and other vulnerable systems after several pilots limped home with punctured cooling systems from tree strikes. One pilot, Lieutenant Francis Gabreski, famously landed at Halesworth with a 6-foot tree branch wedged in his landing gear. The newly installed armor had saved the critical hydraulic lines from being severed. The gunsight modification was subtler, but just as critical. The standard N9 reflector gunsight was calibrated for deflection shooting at altitude, leading a target that was maneuvering in three-dimensional space thousands of feet away. At ground level, your targets weren't maneuvering. They were stationary, parked aircraft, locomotives, fuel trucks, supply columns. You needed a sight that could acquire these targets instantly in the 2-second window you had them in view while traveling at 350 miles per hour. By February 1944, Republic began installing modified K-14 gyroscopic sights with adjusted ranging, effectively turning the Thunderbolt into a gun that could aim itself. You simply put the illuminated pipper on the target, squeeze the trigger, and let the 8.50 caliber Brownings erase whatever you were looking at. They changed the wing racks too. The P-47 could carry bombs, but the standard shackles and release mechanisms were designed for high-altitude level bombing. Dropping a 500-pound bomb from 50 feet was a suicide mission. The blast radius would likely destroy your own aircraft. Engineers, borrowing techniques from the Pacific Theater where skip bombing had been perfected, developed low-altitude attack profiles. A pilot would approach a bridge, bunker, or fuel depot at maximum speed, release the bomb at the very last second, and let it skip like a stone across water or concrete, slamming directly into the target. The P-47 D-25 variant that rolled out in March 1944 came with reinforced wing roots specifically to handle the immense stress of pulling out of these insane near-vertical attack runs. But the most important modification wasn't mechanical. It was tactical training. By April 1944, replacement pilots arriving in England were no longer sent straight into combat. They went through a new, intensive qualification course at bases like RAF at Schmer. They would fly navigation runs at 50 feet across the English countryside, learning to read terrain at speeds where hesitation meant death. They practiced snap, firing at ground targets, old trucks and mock-ups of German aircraft, learning to shoot in 1-second windows. They flew tight formation at hedge height until flying that low felt normal, even instinctive, instead of suicidal. The instructors were pilots who had survived 2 months or more of the real thing over France. Their lesson was simple, brutal, and effective. Altitude kills you, speed saves you, and the P-47 can take damage that would atomize any other fighter. Trust the aircraft, master the altitude, and you might just live long enough to go home. April 8, 1944 was the day the Luftwaffe learned unequivocally that nowhere in France was safe anymore. Colonel Hubert Zemck had spent the 6 months since his initial experiment quietly perfecting the treetop tactic. He had rotated pilots through the new hedge, hopping qualification course, studied intelligence reports on German airfield locations and routines, and waited for the right moment to unleash his entire force at once. That moment arrived with the clear spring weather over Normandy and intelligence confirming that Jagdschwader 2 and Jagdschwader 26, 2 of the Luftwaffe's elite fighter wings, were rotating squadrons through forward bases near Évreux and Bernay. The Germans believed these fields were safe, tucked 60 miles inland, protected by flak batteries and early warning networks. They were wrong. Zemck launched a coordinated strike involving 8 P-47s from 3 fighter groups, the 56th, the 78th, and the 353rd. This was not a bomber escort mission or a high-altitude sweep. This was a pure, low-level hunting expedition. The massive formation split up after crossing the French coast near Le Touquet, each flight dropping down, first to 100 feet, then to 50, thundering across the Norman countryside in 4 ship elements. French resistance spotters later reported they could feel the ground shake as the Thunderbolts passed. The first flight hit airfield A7 at 07 for 7 hours. 16 Bf-109s were on the ground in various states of readiness, some taxiing, some still being fueled, several with pilots just climbing aboard. The P-47s materialized out of the morning haze, doing 360 miles per hour. The German gunners never got a shot off. In 90 seconds of controlled, devastating fire, 11 Bf-109s were transformed into burning hulks. The Americans were gone, already racing toward their secondary targets, staying low. The beauty of the coordinated strike was its timing. The Luftwaffe's command structure depended on radio communication and centralized control. When Évreux was hit, they immediately tried to warn other bases, but the Americans were already there. Bernay was hit 8 minutes after Évreux. Beaulieu, Roger, was hit 4 minutes after that. The Luftwaffe controllers were trying to vector fighters to intercept threats that had already attacked and vanished back into the ground clutter. It was like trying to swat a swarm of flies with a sledgehammer while the flies were systematically tearing the house apart. By 0920 hours, P-47s had hit 7 different airfields across a 40-mile radius. The German pilots who did manage to get airborne found themselves trying to chase targets they couldn't see, flying at altitudes where one mistake meant instant disintegration. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, one of Zemck's original 3 guinea pigs from September, led a flight that caught a Staffel of FW-190s at Coulances airfield during their morning briefing. The German pilots were standing beside their aircraft receiving their orders when Johnson's flight screamed over the boundary fence. Johnson's gun camera footage, later studied by intelligence, showed a scene of apocalyptic chaos. FW-190s erupting in fireballs, pilots sprinting for cover, fuel trucks exploding and spreading a wave of fire across the entire flight line. Johnson's after-action report was clinical and unemotional. Destroyed 4 aircraft on ground, probably destroyed 2 more. Heavy damage to fuel storage, no enemy fire encountered. Time over target, 11 seconds. 11 seconds that erased 2 years of Luftwaffe training, maintenance and logistical effort. The week-long April offensive, what American pilots started calling the Chattanooga Choo-Choo, runs after they expanded their targets to include locomotives. Claimed 47 confirmed German aircraft destroyed on the ground, 23 locomotives and countless trucks, fuel depots and ammunition dumps turned into craters. The cost to the Americans was 3 P-47s. 1 was lost to a lucky flak hit, 1 to flying into a power line the pilot never saw, and 1 to engine failure on the return leg. The loss ratio was nearly 15-1 in favor of the Americans. Suddenly, every Luftwaffe base commander in France was screaming for more flak guns, more camouflage netting, more of anything that might stop the hedge, hopping Thunderbolts. The desperation in German radio intercepts was palpable. The hunters had become the hunted, and they had no idea how to fight back. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, the commander of the Luftwaffe's fighter forces, read the April loss reports and understood immediately that his air force was facing an existential threat. Losing aircraft in aerial combat was one thing. You could replace planes and, with difficulty, train new pilots. But losing them on the ground, along with the fuel trucks, the ammunition, the maintenance crews, and the infrastructure, that was hemorrhaging capability faster than Germany's collapsing industrial and logistical network could possibly replace. On April 19, 1944, Galland issued Directive 487 to all Jagdverband commanders in France. Relocate aircraft dispersal areas at least 800 meters from runways, increase flak coverage on all likely approach paths, and establish visual observer networks in the villages surrounding every airfield. It was a tactical ban, dayed on an arterial bleed, and Galland knew it. The flak repositioning happened first because it was the easiest. Luftwaffe ground forces dragged their 37mm and 20mm automatic cannons away from the airfield perimeters and placed them a kilometer or more out, hoping to catch the P-47s before they reached attack range. It didn't work. The American pilots simply flew even lower, using terrain folds, tree lines, and villages to mask their approach until they were inside the flak envelope. By the time the German gunners could visually acquire and start tracking the screaming fighters, the Thunderbolts had already fired their guns and were screaming past at speeds the traversing mechanisms of the flak guns could not match. Worse, positioning flak batteries in open fields made them targets. P-47 pilots, ever adaptive, started specifically hunting the flak positions, strafing them with 50 caliber fire that turned the gun crews into casualties. One German flak battery commander near Dreux reported losing 17 men in 3 weeks, without scoring a single hit on an American fighter. The observer network was more effective in theory, but created its own problems. The Luftwaffe recruited French civilians, some willing collaborators, many others coerced, to watch the roads and fields near airfields and telephone in warnings when they heard or saw aircraft approaching. This gave the Germans maybe 30 extra seconds of warning, just enough time for pilots and ground crews to sprint away from their aircraft, which meant they lived, but their planes still burned. The French resistance, however, figured out the observer system within days and began feeding a stream of false reports to the Germans, sending Luftwaffe personnel scrambling to their dispersal areas for ghost attacks while real P-47s hit entirely different bases. By mid-May, The observer network had become so polluted with misinformation that German commanders largely stopped trusting it. The dispersal tactic was the most desperate measure. Instead of parking aircraft in neat, efficient rows near the runway for quick arming, refueling and launch, German ground crews were forced to hide individual fighters in tree groves, in barns, and under camouflaged revetments scattered across the countryside. This saved many aircraft from strafing runs, but it utterly destroyed the Luftwaffe's operational readiness. A Bf-109, hidden in a farmer's barn 2 kilometers from the runway, needed 20 minutes or more to be towed or taxied to the flight line, get fueled and armed, and then become airborne. The whole point of a forward fighter base was rapid response. The Americans had forced the Luftwaffe to choose between protecting their aircraft and actually using them. They chose protection, which meant that even when German fighters survived, they weren't flying. Galland tried one more countermeasure in late May, Operation Werewolf *, a plan to use specially modified FW-190s fitted with additional armor and heavy cannons to hunt the hedge hoppers. The theory was that these heavily armed and armored fighters could fly low-altitude patrols and catch the P-47s during their attack runs, when the Americans were focused on their ground targets and most vulnerable. It failed spectacularly. The armored FW-190s were slower, heavier, and less maneuverable than the standard variants, and at 50 feet, those disadvantages were fatal. In the first week of Werewolf operations, the Luftwaffe lost 6 of their modified fighters without scoring a single confirmed kill. The program was quietly cancelled. There was no simple counter to hedge hopping because the tactic didn't fight fair. It exploited every weakness in the Luftwaffe's defensive system: radar, reaction time, flak effectiveness, and pilot training. Simultaneously, the Germans could adapt to one element, maybe two, but not all of them at once. By June 1944, Luftwaffe commanders in France had accepted a grim reality. Their aircraft weren't safe on the ground, weren't safe taking off, and the Americans could strike anywhere at any time with near impunity. Air superiority had degenerated into air terror. Living and fighting at 50 feet meant learning an entirely new language of survival, a language that had nothing to do with the Luftwaffe and everything to do with the unforgiving laws of physics and the French landscape. You could master every tactical principle, execute perfect gun deflection shots, and still die because a flock of starlings exploded through your canopy at 350 miles per hour. Lieutenant James Goodson of the 4th Fighter Group learned this brutal lesson on May 3, 1944, when a bird strike shattered his windscreen over the Loire Valley, the cockpit filled with blood, feathers, and shards of broken plexiglass. Half blind with the 300-mile-per-hour wind tearing at his eyes, he somehow kept the stick steady and climbed out of the death zone, landing at an emergency strip with glass fragments embedded in his cheeks. The bird had been a crow. After that, pilots started calling them flying flak, and developed a keen instinct for spotting bird behavior. If you saw a flock suddenly scatter from a field, you knew something was there: trees, wires, or another aircraft. The birds knew the terrain better than you did. Power lines were a far worse threat because you couldn't see them until it was too late. France's rural electrical grid was a nearly invisible web of death strung between wooden poles at exactly the altitude the American pilots were flying. The wires were thin, gleaming faintly against the landscape, and were tensioned strongly enough to slice through aluminum wing spars and cockpit canopies like cheese wire. In April and May of 1944 alone, the 8th Air Force lost 9 P-47s to power line strikes. These were not counted as combat losses, not even as enemy action. They were simply administrative casualties logged coldly in the records as struck obstacle during low-level flight. Lieutenant William O'Brien hit a line near Charters that wrapped around his propeller and pulled down 3 telephone poles before it snapped. The violent jolt nearly ripped the engine clean off its mounts. He managed to fly another 10 miles before the catastrophic vibrations forced him to bail out. Rescue crews later found his P-47 with 40 feet of copper wire still tangled in the prop blades. The psychological pressure of hedge hopping wasn't just the fear of dying. Every combat pilot lived with that. It was the fear of dying stupidly. At altitude, if you were killed, it was in combat. It was honorable. Someone would write a letter to your mother praising your bravery. At 50 feet, if you were killed, it was because you had misjudged a hillside, hadn't seen a chimney, or got distracted for half a second. Your wingman would simply report failed to return, or more bluntly, flew into the ground, and everyone would know you had made a fatal mistake. That knowledge created a mental burden that some pilots simply could not carry. The 56th Fighter Group had 3 pilots in May 1944 who formally requested transfer back to high-altitude bomber escort duty. One of them, a captain with 14 aerial victories, told the flight surgeon he would rather face the entire Luftwaffe at 20 feet than fly another mission at treat-op level. The surgeon approved the transfer without judgment because everyone understood. The physical toll was equally brutal. Flying at maximum speed for extended periods, while your eyes constantly scanned the rushing terrain for threats, and your hands and arms fought a continuous, subconscious battle with the controls to maintain stability, created an exhaustion that went far beyond normal combat fatigue. Your body was pumped with adrenaline for 2 hours straight. Your eyes ached from the strain of tracking ground features that rushed at you at 6 miles per minute. Pilots would land after a hedge-hopping mission and find their flight suits soaked through with sweat, despite flying in 50-degree Fahrenheit weather. Some men landed with hand tremors so severe they couldn't hold a coffee cup steady for an hour afterward. Flight surgeons documented cases of pilots who had to dictate their after-action reports because they could not physically hold a pen. Then there were the ones who adapted too well. The pilots who, after surviving a dozen or more low-level missions, started taking unnecessary risks because they felt invincible. They would fly at 30 feet instead of 50, just for the thrill of it. They would strafe heavily defended targets in broad daylight that should have been bypassed. The squadron commanders watched for this carefully, because overconfidence at that altitude had a 100% mortality rate. It was only a question of when. Major Gerald Johnson grounded one of his best pilots for a week in May after the man flew under a railway bridge instead of over it. He wasn't punishing him for violating regulations. He was grounding him because the pilot had stopped being afraid. At 50 feet, a healthy, respectful fear was the only thing keeping you alive. Lose that and you became just another statistic. June 6, 1944, 0530 hours. Dawn was breaking over the Normandy coast, and 156-0 Allied troops were beginning to assault 5 invasion beaches in the largest amphibious operation in human history. The entire enterprise, from the fate of the individual soldier on Omaha Beach to the grand strategic design, depended on one critical assumption, that the Luftwaffe wouldn't show up. Not asterisk couldn't asterisk, but asterisk wouldn't asterisk, because American fighters would make any German attempt to reach the beaches a suicide mission. General Dwight D. Eisenhower had bet the entire invasion on achieving absolute air supremacy. The hedge-hopping P-47s and the men who flew them were about to cash that check. Before the first landing craft touched the sand, 289 Thunderbolts were already screaming across northern France at treetop level, their mission to hit every known Luftwaffe base within a 150-mile radius of the coast. The strike began at 5 hours, 90 minutes before H hour. The timing was surgical, designed to catch the Germans at their most vulnerable moment, right as they were preparing dawn patrols to investigate the massive invasion fleet their radar had been tracking all night. At Creil Airfield, 35 miles north of Paris, a *Grupp* of Bf-109 was taxiing into takeoff position when 8 P-47s from the 78th Fighter Group materialized out of the pre-dawn gloom. The German pilots had their canopies open, checking instruments, completely focused on their pre-flight routines. They died without ever seeing what killed them. 18 Bf-109s were destroyed in the time it takes to read this paragraph. At Booz, at Abbeville, at Amiens, the same scene repeated itself with terrifying consistency. German fighters burning on the ground before they could even attempt to defend the beaches that were about to be stormed. The hedge-hopping tactics evolved in real time that morning into something more sophisticated and coordinated than simple strafing runs. The fighter groups executed continuous, overlapping sweeps. As one flight finished its attack and pulled off the target, another was already inbound from a different direction. The Germans never got a respite, never had a moment to regroup. Radio intercepts captured Luftwaffe controllers screaming contradictory orders, trying to vector fighters to intercept threats that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. At 06:00 hours, *Jagdschwader 26 * attempted to launch a *Staffel * from Lille-Vendeville to attack the invasion fleet. They managed to get 4 aircraft airborne before a flight of P-47s hit the field. Those 4 that did launch were immediately bounced by high-altitude P-51 Mustangs waiting in the cloud layer above. None of the German fighters reached the coast. The systematic destruction wasn't just about killing aircraft, it was about breaking the Luftwaffe's will to even try. By 08:00 hours, as American troops were fighting and dying in the surf at Omaha Beach, the Luftwaffe had managed to put exactly 2 aircraft over the entire invasion fleet, 2 reconnaissance planes that were shot down within minutes. Adolf Hitler reportedly spent the morning raging at his air commanders, demanding to know where the Luftwaffe was. The answer was simple. They were burning on airfields across France. The hedge-hoppers had flown 847 individual sorties on D-Day alone, an operational tempo that should have been impossible. They didn't fly neat 8-hour missions with rest periods. They flew, landed, rearmed and refueled in a frantic 20-minute turnaround and launched again. Some pilots flew 4 sorties before the sun set. The ground crews worked with such manic, desperate intensity that several men collapsed from exhaustion at their posts. As the daylight hours wore on, the P-47s expanded their targets beyond airfields to systematically destroying anything that could move toward Normandy. Trains, truck convoys, fuel depots, bridges. If it could support a German counterattack, it became a priority target. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski led a flight that caught a German panzer column attempting to move toward Keene. The tanks were buttoned up, their crews inside, moving at road speed with no air cover whatsoever. Gabreski's flight didn't have bombs, only their .50 caliber armor. Piercing incendiary rounds, they strafed the column from the rear, aiming for the thinner engine decks. 3 Panzer Roman 4s brewed up, their ammunition cooking off in violent secondary explosions. The rest of the column scattered into the tree line and did not move again until after dark. Multiply that scene across 50 different roads and rail lines, and you begin to understand why German reinforcements that should have reached the Normandy beachhead in 6 hours took 3 days to arrive. As the sun set on June 6th, the scorecard was staggering. The Luftwaffe had managed to fly a mere 319 sorties over the entire Normandy invasion area. The Allies had flown 14,674. The difference was hedge-hopping. Every German aircraft that managed to survive the initial ground attacks faced a relentless gauntlet of low-level American fighters between their base and the battlefield. The few that made it through accomplished nothing. The invasion succeeded because the sky over those 5 beaches belonged entirely to the Allies. And the sky belonged to the Allies because P-47 pilots had spent the previous 7 months learning how to kill an air force before it could even get off the ground. D-Day wasn't just one in the bloody surf and on the sand. It was one at 50 feet over France, one burning airfield, one shattered locomotive, one destroyed fuel dump at a time. The hedge-hopping revolution did not end when the war in Europe did. It fundamentally rewrote the manual on how modern air forces think about close air support and battlefield interdiction. By August 1944, every Allied air force in Europe had adopted some version of the treetop tactics. British Typhoons and Tempests began flying similar low-level Rhubarb and Ranger strikes against German targets. the Soviet Union's Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik, an aircraft already designed for ground attack, refined its low-altitude approach patterns based on American after-action reports. The Luftwaffe itself tried to copy the tactics in their few remaining operational sectors on the Eastern Front. But by then they lacked the fuel, the training time, and the air superiority necessary to make it work. The P-47 Hedge hoppers had demonstrated a profound and enduring tactical truth, that air superiority wasn't just about controlling the sky asterisk above asterisk the battlefield. It was about controlling every single inch of airspace from the ground upward. You couldn't just win the fight at 20,000 feet anymore, you had to dominate the fight at 50 feet as well. The casualty statistics from this period validate the entire brutal approach. Between April and August 1944, P-47 Group's Flying Hedge hop missions were credited with destroying 1,823 German aircraft on the ground, 315 locomotives, over 90 Aero-Zero trucks and armored vehicles, and hundreds of bridges and fuel depots. Their own losses in the same period were 289 aircraft. Of these, 114 were lost to flak, 87 to ground obstacles and mechanical failure during low-level flight, 67 to enemy fighters, and 21 to unknown causes. This represented a loss rate of roughly 15% over 5 months of the most intense combat operations in aviation history. The numbers were brutal, but they were sustainable. More importantly, the German aircraft they destroyed on the ground never went on to kill Allied bomber crews, never strafed Allied troops, never contested the skies over France. The cold mathematics of industrial attrition favored the side that could replace its losses. And by mid-1944, that side was unequivocally the United States, not Nazi Germany. The legacy of these tactics extended far beyond the Second World War. The Korean War saw American pilots applying hedge, hopping principles against North Korean and Chinese forces with devastating effect. F-80 Shooting Star and F-84 Thunderjet fighters screamed across the Korean countryside at tree level, hitting supply columns and airfields using tactics directly refined over the fields of France. The speeds were higher, jets versus propellers, but the fundamental approach remained identical. Fly low, fly fast, exploit the terrain, and hit your targets before they know you're there. The Vietnamese and Pathet Lao later learned these lessons the hard way when American F-4 Phantoms and A-7 Corsairs flew low-level interdiction missions along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The terminology changed NAPAV, the Earth, flying replaced hedge, hopping, but the DNA was pure 1944 P-47 tactics. Modern close air support doctrine still carries the fingerprints of those Thunderbolt pilots. The A-10 Thunderbolt Roman II Warthog. Designed in the 1970s specifically for low-altitude ground attack, incorporated every hard-learned lesson from the war. Heavy titanium armor protecting the pilot and vital systems from ground fire, the modern equivalent of tree strikes, redundant flight control systems, and a massive, powerful gun, the 30mm GAU-8 Avenger, optimized for destroying tanks and ground targets. The training for 10 pilots, and indeed for all pilots flying close air support, emphasizes terrain masking, HICE, speed low-level approaches, and the tactical surprise that comes from staying in the ground clutter. Air Force survival schools still teach the core principles that Hub-Zemk's pilots discovered through bloody trial and error. That altitude gives you visibility, but the ground gives you surprise and survival. That speed at low altitude is a better defense than maneuverability at high altitude, and that the Earth itself is a weapon if you know how to use it. The psychological and institutional legacy might be even more important than the tactical one. The hedge-hopping campaign proved that conventional wisdom could be catastrophically wrong, that doctrine written in peacetime might need to be thrown out the moment real combat begins, and that sometimes the right answer is the one that sounds completely insane. Hub-Zemk was never caught, marshaled for his unauthorized, doctrine-shattering tactical experiments. Instead, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The Army Air Forces, and later the independent United States Air Force, internalized a crucial cultural lesson about innovation under fire. When faced with unacceptable losses, you don't just keep doing the same thing harder. You question everything. You empower your best people, even junior officers, to experiment and find a better way. That institutional flexibility, that willingness to adapt or die, became a cornerstone of American air power doctrine. If you walk through the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio today, you will find a P-47 Thunderbolt suspended from the ceiling in a clean, dramatic pose. The placard will talk about its service as a high-altitude bomber escort, its massive R-2800 engine and its rugged construction. This is all historically accurate, but it is incomplete. The real, untold story of the Thunderbolt is that it became most dangerous, most revolutionary, when it flew lowest. When pilots pointed that massive nose at the ground instead of the sky, when it became a hedge, hopping predator that taught an entire generation of aviators how to fight and win at the altitude where physics and surprise mattered more than any altitude advantage. 7 critical months, 50 perilous feet, and a stubborn willingness to ignore every rule in the book. That is how American pilots caught the Luftwaffe off guard, broke its back in France, and helped win the war in the air, one thunderous, low-level pass at a time.